Hey, fifth grade. For today's writing workshop lesson, you just have to watch this video lesson. We are actually going to start writing our next free verse poem, but we aren't going to start that until tomorrow because this lesson's a little bit lengthy and I don't want to overwhelm you guys with a heavy workload. I just want you to be able to come in and watch this and then, of course, apply everything that you learn from these video lessons to your writing as we move forward. So there's not an actual task for you to complete or anything to turn in for today's lesson. You're just going to watch the video and take it all in. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, I'm going to move myself over here, I think. We're going to be talking about breaking lines, stanzas, and punctuating. So go ahead and turn to these notes in your ELA reference folder. This can be found on page 19. I'm going to go ahead and read this to you, and then I will teach the lesson. And I think it will make more sense as we go on. Poetry is written to be spoken. Break lines to emphasize breaths, pauses, or silences. Break on nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. So this is how you decide where one line ends and the next one begins. Try to draft in lines. When you revise, insert 2 forward slashes between the words to create new line break, and double lines between lines to indicate a new stanza break. Experiment with the size, shape, and length of lines and stanzas. In general, punctuate and capitalize poems if they're prose, but don't be afraid to experiment with or without caps and punctuation either. So, if you were writing this on paper, and some of you do like to do that, that's just how your creative process works. So, when we start drafting our next poem, if you decide that you would like to do that in your writing and process folder on actual paper before you get started typing it, that's totally fine. The important thing to remember is that if you do this, when you go in to revise that piece of writing, you're going to do that with a pen in your hand. And so if you decide that you want to move some lines around, or you want to break a line in a different place, or if you want to create a stanza in a place that you had not done that before, then you will use these symbols. And I think this will make more sense as we continue through the lesson. So just hang in there with me if this seems a little confusing right now. Just remember that these notes are here, and if you need to, you can always go back and watch these video lessons. That's why I like posting them, because it gives you access to the lesson at any point that you need it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on through the rest of the lesson, and we'll get a little further in. Beginning free verse poets are often stymied by how to handle line breaks. Rhymed poems are obvious. Lines end with words that rhyme. But in free verse, the length and content of a line are a matter of choice. So how do you choose which words belong together as a line? How does your mind, eyes, ears, and even lungs help you choose? First, it's important to recognize that poetry is written to be spoken. Free verse poetry generally breaks its lines to emphasize the pauses a reader's voice might make. Line breaks signal the briefest of rests, breaths, or silences. The poet Mary Oliver, comparing a free verse poem to a dance, says that the pause is part of the motion of the poem, as hesitation is part of the dance. Next, it's good to recognize that most poets, I'm going to move myself down here. It's good to recognize that most poets end their lines on strong words, nouns, verbs, and modifiers. That is, adjectives and adverbs. If you look back through the poems we've read so far this year, you'll see that this is the case. Slicing the line at a weak word, an article, preposition, or conjunction like the, of, or and tells your reader to pause at an insignificant moment, one that's not important in the poem, rather than at the point of meaning. Mary Oliver isn't tentative about this. The most important point in the line is the end of the line. So as readers, we know that if we're looking to identify the main idea in a piece of prose, we would go to the first and the last sentences in the paragraph first, because we know that that's where the meat of the information is likely to be found. In poetry, we go to the end of the line because the end of the line should have impact on meaning and sound. So that's what Mary Oliver is talking about in this quote. Read Molly's poem, Rain Lullaby, with me and notice the strong words at the ends of her lines. Rain Lullaby. I listen to the rain as it drizzles on our roof and snuggled even deeper. Under the warm weight of my covers, my hands open my book, and I begin to read. In a moment, I am lost as the story unfolds. Slowly, slowly, I feel. My eyelids turn to lead. I shut my book and turn off the light. Already adrift, I close my eyes, so glad to be where I am, half asleep in the warmth of my bed, with the rain as my lullaby. Now imagine if Molly had broken her first line at the, or her second line at on or our, or the third line at the word even. Can you see and hear how her poem would have been weakened? How important the ends of her lines are? So let's take a look at that. If the lines had not ended the way they did, it wouldn't have the impact. As I read this poem the first time, I kind of felt myself starting to drift the way that she does in the poem. And to reinforce what I'm saying about how you should end your lines on strong words, if you weren't sure what this poem was about, you could pick up the meaning very easily by just reading the last word of each line. Rain, roof, deeper, covers, book, read, lost, unfolds, feel, lead, lead. Excuse me, that was terrible. Book, light, adrift, eyes, am, asleep, warmth, bed, lullaby. So the point that I made about identifying the main idea or the central idea also comes into play if you look at it that way as well. Finally, free verse poets need to be aware of how their poems look on the page. Line breaks and stanza breaks are a poem's form. Poetry is the only genre in which form matters as much as content, which is one of the reasons I have a hard time at poetry readings. My eyes itch to see how the poet has chosen to arrange the words I'm hearing as lines and stanzas. Read what Mary Oliver has to say about line length and breaks. I cannot say too many times how powerful the technique of line length and line breaks are. You cannot swing the lines around or fling strong-sounding words or scatter soft ones to no purpose. So she's saying put some thought into how you want your line to appear on the page and what you want those line endings to be. It's not something you can just pick and choose and not think about. It's a conscious choice. Try to draft your free verse poems in lines. You can always revise by shortening, lengthening, and moving lines. But I think it's important to enter into an act of poetry by visualizing your draft as a poem, not prose, right from the start. And if you guys will think about the very first draft that we typed of our poem, I had text on the page in lines and stanzas and asked you to add that, add those lines as you went. I did that so that you would draft your poem in lines and stanzas. Now, as we start our second poem this week, I will not do that for you in draft one, because by doing that for you, I created the form that you stuck with. So I created about how long your line should be. I created how many stanzas your poem would have. I created how many lines that stanza should have. And that is not my decision as your teacher to make. It is your decision as a writer to make. But I cannot reinforce this enough. You should draft your poem in lines and stanzas. Do not draft it the way that you would a story, one huge chunk of text, or putting it into complete sentences and putting it into paragraphs, because it's not a paragraph. It's not a story. It's a poem. So you have to write in lines and stanzas. All right, let's move on. If that's too difficult for you right now, it is okay to enter your poem as prose and then go back into the draft and divide it into lines. Then revise and polish based on those breaks, which is what Nora did when she was starting out as a poet. Look with me at the first draft of her Rain poem, which went down on the page as a prose paragraph. So guys, I really can't say this enough. If you can draft in lines and stanzas, do that because it's easier. But if you can't, if your brain just won't allow you to, you can take this approach. Rain poem, first draft. As I ride home with Mom, I see 2 dots of light approaching. Instead of closing my eyes as I usually do, I keep them open and see the light show, the ornaments of the sky falling, shattering their delicacy on the windshield. I see the decorations on the windshield drip slowly down to the black tar below. Then the car passes. The ornaments and decorations are put down for the season, but as the next car comes by, they return. So this is not organized into lines or stanzas of a poem. It looks more like a paragraph or a huge chunk of text. In a conference with her teacher, her teacher showed Nora how to insert double slash marks at the points where she might break lines, to listen for words, phrases, and sentences that seem to belong together, to notice the junctures at which she breathes or rested as she read her poem. The second draft shows how Nora marked it up. So you can see she went through that chunk of text and then she added these slash marks. These are going to become line endings. Then she rewrote the poem, this time skipping down and starting a new line each time she hit one of her slash marks. And from there she revised by cutting and polishing. Here's the final version of Nora's poem, now titled Revealing Rain. So you can see she crafted a title also. Revealing Rain. Do you guys see how this does look like the poems that we read every day in class? It started out as a huge chunk of text. She added her slash marks to that chunk of text, and then she was able to redraft this poem in the lines and a stanza of a poem. So follow along with me and listen. As I ride home with Mom, 2 dots of light approach. Instead of closing my eyes, as I usually do, I watch the window as it reveals the ornaments of the sky falling. The decorations on the windshield drip to black tar below. Then the other car passes. The scene goes black before my eyes. But when the next car crosses our path, I will keep my eyes wide for the return of the rain ornaments. So this is actually a really cool poem about the way that Nora sees the rain droplets at night as her mom's car meets other cars. So the headlights pass through the rain droplets, and there's kind of a prism effect that makes them look like ornaments. So that's what this poem is about. And notice how she ended each line with some strong words that allowed us to read this poem the way it was meant to be read as a poem, breaking and pausing at the end of each line. Take a look with me at David's poem about a swim meet. I'm going to go ahead and read it and then we'll jump back up here. The meet. Step up. Take your mark. Go. I burst off the starting block, fly through the air, slice into the water, and glide. I stroke, gasp for air, until I'm at the end of the pool, where I flip and push off as hard as I can. The screams of the crowd fill my ears as I take one more breath, reach the wall, hit it, win. Do you see how he made his lines short on purpose so the form of the poem would mimic his subject? This is a poem about swimming, and because he has the short, choppy lines, it kind of mimics the act of swimming. So it's like, step up, take your mark, go. I'm not a swimmer, but I think you get the idea. As a swimmer, David was moving, so his poem moves too. One long, fast stanza of short lines. I do want to talk to you briefly about punctuation here. A word about punctuation. Beginning free verse poets are often tempted to put a comma at the end of every line, maybe as a way to enforce a breath or a rest there. But since the function of the white space at the end of the line is to signal the reader to breathe or rest, the comma is redundant, which means you don't need it. Try to punctuate your free verse poems as if they're prose sentences. That is, use commas, dashes, and periods sparingly, as if the lines of the poem came one after another in the paragraph. So, yes, punctuate it, but don't break each line with a comma. Think about it as a continuous sentence, and where would that comma be if it were in a paragraph? And then only put your commas there, okay? Also, a word about capital letters. Many beginning poets, unsure about when and how to capitalize lines, play it safe by capitalizing the first word of every line. As a result, the power of a lot of good poems gets undercut. All those capital letters can look pompous, as if the poet were saying, "Every line I'm writing is so profound it must be capitalized." Today, most free verse poets capitalize their poems as they would prose. That is, they capitalize the first words of the sentences and the proper nouns. Again, that also depends on if they choose to punctuate the way they would a sentence. Finally, what about stanza breaks? It's helpful to know that the word stanza comes from the Latin word stantia, which means standing or stopping. The word stanza means stopping place or room. Ron Padgett, a poet, says it helps to think of stanzas as the rooms in the house that is your poem. He says the stanza break almost always indicates a pause, however slight, just as you have to slow down to go through a door. So when you're walking through a house, room to room, you do have to slow down a little bit to walk through the doorway into the next room. So he's saying, think about your stanzas as a room, your whole poem as a room, and each stanza is a different room in the poem. All right, the main thing is to make rooms that are big enough to be useful, shapely enough to be attractive, and not so empty as to be disappointing. Look at Annie's poem, The Storm. As she played with the form of the poem, she settled on stanzas of 6 lines each. She broke her stanzas at the points where the action changes in the story her poem is telling, just as a writer of prose narrative would break for a new paragraph at each shift in the action. In the first stanza, Annie and her dad head out to pull lobster traps, in spite of the ominous or threatening skies. In the second stanza, it starts to pour. In the third, they haul traps in the middle of the storm. And in the final stanza, they return to the shore. You'll see what I mean. Follow along with me. The storm. Under the gloomy gray skies hanging low, I pulled on my oilskins and climbed into the wooden skiff. That's a boat. I was skeptical. You were not. It'll clear up, you assured me, so off we set. Before even our first trap was hauled, rain began to trickle down our cheeks and onto the orange rubber of the oilskins. Within a few traps, it was streaming from the sky, lashing onto our bowed heads. Trap after trap we hauled, and I did my jobs mechanically as we collected our booty. Mottled brown and green lobsters. By the way, she refers to them as her booty. That's their treasure. That's what they're out there doing. and the lobsters are what she's talking about. Mottled just means spotted. The dog bounded along the seaweedy rocks, trying to keep up with us. Water sloshed over the stern of the open boat. I shivered beneath my hood. We pulled into the dock with numbed faces, frozen fingers. I met my black dog under the trees of the shore, and with stiff hands tried to unbuckle my soaked life vest. As we walked to the boat shop at the top of the hill, as the rain poured down on the blue-gray ocean. In free verse poetry, stanza breaks, like line breaks, are up to the poet. As Ron Padgett puts it, you may want all the rooms in your house to be the same size, or you may want to vary the size of your rooms, depending on what they're for. He concludes, the main thing is to make rooms that are big enough to be useful, shapely enough to be attractive, and not so empty as to be disappointing. Line breaks and stanza breaks are techniques I'll help you with when we conference about your poems and when I copy edit them. My bottom line request right now is that you experiment. Make choices and resist settling for a poem in the form in which it first goes down on the page. So play around with it. Just because you wrote it that way in your first draft doesn't mean that's how it has to stay all the way through that third draft. When you go in and revise, move things around, experiment with line length and stanza length and the number of stanzas even. I think one of the greatest benefits of word processing, which means typing it on a computer, is that it's easy to experiment with line and stanza breaks because we can just drag and drop those or copy and paste them to different places. To bump words down to another line, to separate lines from the lines that come before them, to build white space around them, and consider how your poem reads and looks strongest. Guys, that's really it. I know that was a lot of information, so if you find yourself confused, don't hesitate to come back to this at different points in the writing process and rewatch this video. That's the point of posting them so that you can access them as many times as you need and whenever you need. Love you guys and miss you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.